Mr. Van der Vooren is a senior environmental consultant at AMEC Americas and responsible for air quality and regulatory issues. He's been involved in environmental issues for almost 30 years and has worked with the Air and Waste Management Association for almost 25 years. You are now the chair of the Honors and Awards Committee for the AWMA.
Yeah, actually that's a little bit dated. That was 2 years ago, but that's okay.
Okay. Well, you've been quite involved anyways in that association. Today you're going to talk about odor assessment and odor modeling in determining appropriate mitigation.
Thank you, Elizabeth. My apologies in advance. I flew in from a vacation in Europe about midnight last night. My body got here. I'm not sure my mind is here, and I'm not sure my voice has followed me across the Atlantic either. So if my voice disappears halfway through this presentation, Alex Brado, my co-author on this, has offered to step up and finish up my presentation. So we'll see how far I get before my voice totally vanishes. I'm going to look at a little bit different situation in terms of control. We've been talking a lot about at-source mitigation. We've been dealing with a situation in Toronto where we've been able to do something where we actually can look at something called at-receptor mitigation. We've talked about odor being a challenge. We've talked about it being something that people respond to in different ways. So rather than just looking at odor in the same way we look at chemical, let's also look at how we can maybe tweak people's behaviors or responses to odor and try to minimize the potential for adverse effects and nuisance complaints. So that's a bit what I'm going to talk about. For those of you who know Toronto, those of you who are visiting and are coming as tourists, you may have gone down to the CN Tower. It's over here. What we're talking about is a facility that's right on the waterfront in Toronto. It's the Redpath Sugar Refinery. They basically bring in cane sugar by ships and they process it into sugar products. It's been there since the 50s, not unlike just about every major city in the world that has a waterfront. There's been incredible pressure to try and develop the lands around Redpath into condominiums and housing. Concern, of course, is Redpath is a 24-hour-a-day operation. Ships come in, they're open unloading. They're doing a lot of processes there. It's a 24-hour-a-day operation, so we're somewhat challenged by that. Just a bit of background. You've heard this a couple of times already. Odor is a regulated pollutant under our Environmental Protection Act. It's recognized as a contaminant. We don't have a specific standard for odor. We do try to manage it by complaint-driven process, i.e. if somebody complains, you have a problem. Try to avoid what we call Section 14, the adverse effects impact in our act. Challenge is we do have guidance for these types of analyses. Once in a while, we do try to wrestle with whether one odor unit on a 10-minute average is a standard or a requirement by permit. And of course, we get lots of good discussions about FIDOL, which we've heard a number of times today. The challenge is, if I were to say to you, anybody in this room that's dealing with odor, if I said to you I designed something down to one odor unit, would that guarantee me that I will not have complaints in the future, or guarantee that I would not have a complaint that would lead to an adverse effect? And I don't think anybody in this room would say that's adequate. I think one time in the past I did a presentation where I took the one odor unit and said let's deal with that as if it was a toxic contaminant, where we do to divide by 10 for lifetime exposure, divide by 10 for sensitive individual, start with the lowest detectable amounts, or the lowest lowest effect level for a toxin. What you'd end up with is something like, I think the number was something like 0.001 odor units as an equivalent for a health-based standard to be protective. Well, we're not going to try and design to 0.001 odor units in a situation like this. So the question came when developers started to crop up around, started to put forward proposals to change the development around Redpath. How are we going to deal with this? How are we going to deal with it in terms of potential future complaints, and red path operations. How do we predict that? What we basically said was, well, we don't have a lot of sensitive receptors in the area right now, or at least not close by. We do have some that are about a kilometer and a half off, so we had a close look at those. We did look at what could we do to try and minimize what the emissions were from the facility. Far too much detail on this one. I think the key bit is, one of the key points I'd like to make here is, we do have a requirement in Ontario, or some guidance in Ontario, that says you shouldn't build any sensitive receptors within about 300 meters of facilities such as red path. 300 meters, red path is about here. For those of you who know the area, the Gardiner Expressway is here. 300 meters is a circle about like that. There was no way we were going to move forward on anything in that area where we basically tried to take a position of, folks, we're going with the guidance. We're saying no sensitive receptors within 300 meters. I mean, that would be the ideal position, but given the current pressures for development, for infill, for intensification, that was not something that Red Path or anybody really wanted to go into any hearings with or a court challenge on. So we initially started using a very simple approach with the nasal ranger. It's a complex facility, lots of sources. We looked at some back calculations from the nasal ranger saying, well, it's coming off this volume source, it's coming off these different processes. Did some back calculations, got some ideas as to what the emissions would be, and used that a little bit for some initial assessment. The problem was, it didn't really have enough detail. We couldn't tell from the nasal ranger what the specific sources were. When we then started to try and model, for example, an elevated condo complex right next to the facility, the nasal ranger was giving us some back calculations from somebody standing on the street, but not up at 50 meters or 100 meters above the building. So we had a real tough time trying to predict levels higher up and as we went out. So as much as the nasal ranger gave us some initial information, gave us some initial ideas, it really wasn't the answer to what we needed to do. Not surprising, like a lot of you have done, we went out and did some measurements, sent our stack sampling crew out. We measured a fair number of sources, about 60, I think, in total. A lot of odor assessment, a lot of monitoring being done. Odor panel testing, triplicate on most of these sources. Some of them we had to do 2 or 3 times, not because we weren't comfortable with the results, but they varied by season. We also found that some of the ship loads, we also measured the odors coming off ships when they were opened up. The sugar cane ferments inside the ship. Different sources of sugar cane had different odor characteristics as they came to the site. So we had a lot of variables we had to deal with. We took that, did our usual, plugged it all into AirMod, run numbers. We used the Scentroid to do a little bit of cross-checking. We tried to get that out every time we were doing odor testing, so we had a good match. Worked relatively well, factor of 2 to 3. That's about reasonable for what we were looking for, and we were certainly getting that kind of confirmation. We also looked at a couple of other issues. You're starting to get into some fairly complex geometries when you're talking about condos going up around the building. It's downtown Toronto. It's not exactly a flat plane. So we also had some fluid dynamics work done to see whether we had to worry about odors on the backside of buildings and how much would we get as a reduction on the backside of buildings. Did we need to worry about as much as we did on the exposed faces of the buildings? And sure enough, with some testing and some work we did, it looked like we would get about a factor of 3 or 4 reduction on the backside. All very helpful to know in terms of how you're going to develop things. And I reiterate here, keep in mind we had a nice situation here. These were developers coming to Redpath to say, we want to build near you. So they were being very cooperative with Redpath in terms of what their designs, their layouts, what they were trying to do. So we had a lot of input into this. This would be much more difficult, almost impossible to do if you had existing development already there and tried to retrofit something where you've already got an issue. So I think the thing I want to focus on a little bit in the next 5 minutes or so, not so much the at source. We did look at that. We did assess a number of sources. There were some sources, or are some sources that are going to be controlled. In fact, they ended up being none of the solutions we've seen here. Redpath basically redesigned their process to take out one of their process steps, or change one of their process steps to eliminate an odor source that was about 40–50% of their total odor emissions. Very useful thing to do. But we also then looked and sat down with the developers of what can we do to minimize the exposure risk. Keep in mind, we're dealing with odor, so we're dealing with nuisance complaint. So what are people going to be exposed to became the question. So how can we try and minimize? Effectively, the constant question was, what can we do to try and minimize somebody complaining that they're smelling an odor, if they smell an odor? Well, I think one of the things we very quickly realized for any development in that area was that if you start smelling odors from a facility inside your condo, that's going to lead to complaints. If you're inside your condo 24 hours a day, any time of the day or night, and you start smelling an odor, you're likely to complain. So one of the at-receptor mitigations that has become required in all the buildings that are going in around Redpath is to put in a proper ventilation system within the unit to allow for odor filtration, so that the units themselves will have minimal odor. In fact, get clean air all the time. At least clean air, outdoor air. We looked at some of the closer developments. Could we work with the developer to provide some buffer buildings in between? And by buffer buildings here, I mean non-residential, non-sensitive use buildings. Commercial buildings, office buildings that have sealed windows. Again, with the intent that if you've got a sealed window, it's less likely you'll get odor inside the building. We also require the odor filtration on those buildings. So again, try to minimize the complaints and where people will have complaints. If you start thinking that through in terms of other things you can look at, we also looked at a couple of other areas. What else can we do to change people's behavior? Well, one of the things we looked at was on some of the more exposed faces, small balconies. If you have a large 5-meter by 5-meter balcony and you can put all sorts of outside furniture on, you're more likely to expect to be able to sit out on that 25 square meter balcony and not smell something. If you've got one of those smaller apartment balconies where it's just barely wide enough to put 2 chairs side by side, and even then you're a little bit uncomfortable, figure that people won't be outside as much. Again, reduce the potential for people being outside with expectations of smelling. We have some of the buildings, we requested them to put in self-closing doors. In other words, don't have patios or balconies where you can open up the whole glass wall and suddenly the entire outside is inside. A, the ventilation systems we're talking about are not going to work when you do that. B, again, there'll be that expectation that when you have those windows and doors wide open, that you are going to have odor-free air. So on some of the units, we've got basically doors, not quite like these, but with self-closers on them. The idea being that once they're open, you have to work hard to keep them jammed open. The other thing we did and requested and put into the design, and I'm sure all of you have experiences of this, if you see it, you're more likely to complain about it. So one of the things we tried to do very carefully with a lot of the open outdoor amenity spaces, rooftop patios, common spaces, was to basically say, if you're going to put those in, that's fine, but let's put some barriers up in between so you're not looking right out at the fan on the top of the roof of the Redpath building. For 2 reasons. One is the visual. You're not going to see it. You're not going to complain about it because you're not seeing it, or less likely to complain about it. The other is, again, back to the sort of factor of 3 or 4 in terms of around building turbulence. That wall will provide some turbulence, some extra dilution, some extra variability in the odor, which may, again, minimize or reduce the risk for potential complaints. One of the things we ended up doing, of course, when you start doing all this, is we need to look at certain levels. Where did we want these different what we're calling avoidance mitigation protocols to apply. Can't give you the exact numbers because those are all under confidentiality agreements at this point with the various developers. We basically looked at existing exposures, what was being done for existing at-receptor mitigation, the small balconies, et cetera, at some of the ones that were further off. We looked at that, reduced it a little bit, and then said, okay, so where do we need to put where? And in effect, these different shaded areas on these drawings, or on these three-dimensional representation, level 1 to 4, you can't read that from back there, but that basically defines in an agreement with the developer what they will do for at-receptor mitigation at those various locations. Just basically, there it goes. Almost there. I think you're good, Alex. I think I can get through the last two slides. One of the challenges, of course, is always, how do we deal with modeling numbers, odor predictions, to try and avoid, as a surrogate for avoiding future annoyance? I was going to say it's a fool's game. It's a difficult thing to do. At best, we figure we've tried to tie things down as best as we can for RedPath in terms of future development in that area. There really is no lack, there was no way of getting regulatory certainty on this. Think about going to MOE or any regulator you have and saying, look, we're going to do this, guarantee us that we will not have a problem in the future. That's not going to happen either. So the best we could do is to try and negotiate this as best we could. The other key issue here is, and again, we had a very, I won't say it's a unique situation, but a good situation here in the fact that we had development coming into the area. They needed land use change to come. It gave us an opportunity to sit and negotiate some fairly solid contracts and agreements with the developer that will then pass on to the condo owners and the condo development from there. That's it. So not all mitigation has to be at source.
Thank you. We have time for a couple of questions. Yes, please.
Tony, when you did your stack sampling for odors, one of the things I do find in any kind of sampling, sometimes when you just take odor bags, it just feels like blind sampling, right? It's always good to have a hydrocarbon analyzer sitting beside it to pick up temporal variations, that kind of stuff. Could you do anything for that?
Not really. I mean, in this case, if you think about what sugar processing is like, right? I mean, they basically take cane sugar, you dissolve, you basically mash it all up, dissolve out the sugar, then re-evaporate or evaporate the water off of that to create a sugar crystal. There's really not a lot of hydrocarbons in that. I mean, I suspect there's something out there, somebody out there that would know what makes molasses smell like molasses, but that's effectively what the smell is in most of that area. It's sort of almost a molasses smell at times. When the ships arrive and they open the hatches, depending on how long they've been in transit and how hot it's been, you sometimes get a bit of whiff of almost like alcohol. Well, it is alcohol. You've basically got fermenting smell coming off the sugar cane that's in the ships. So, yeah, there wasn't hope, especially in this case where, I mean, on a couple of those sources that were the higher strength sources, we may have been able to do a bit more characterization. But of the sources I mentioned, probably half, if not more, are basically just general building ventilation. What you're smelling is all the little unit processes within the building that is venting out through the building. Very low concentration, large volume. That becomes the challenge. I mean, ideally it had been 4 or 5 sources that caused all the problem. We would just control that and not have to deal with all this stuff. But once we got past the 2 or 3 we could control, the rest were just too many, too diverse, too large a flow rate.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. van der Vooren.